listening to She Rises, a podcast dedicated to women who are ready to stop settling and start living their lives by design. If you're ready to talk about the stuff that weighs you down and get practical advice on everything from your health, body image, spirituality, relationships, and personal growth, then you're in the right place. Hello, I'm Giovanna Capozza, your host, master coach, spiritual teacher, and mind-body expert, and I'm on a mission to unsettle women all over the world. Are you ready to rise? Your children are not your children. They are the sons and daughters of life's longing for itself. They come through you, but not from you. And though they are with you, yet they belong not to you. You may give them your love, but not your thoughts. For they have their own thoughts. You may house their bodies, but not their souls. For their souls dwell in the house of tomorrow, which you cannot visit, not even in your dreams. You may strive to be like them, but seek not to make them like you. For life goes not backwards, nor tarries with yesterday. You are the bows from which your children as living arrows are sent forth. The archer sees the mark upon the path of the infinite, and he bends you with his might that his arrows may go swift and far. Let your bending in the archer's hand be for gladness. For even as he loves the arrow that flies, so he loves also the bow that is stable. That's a quote from Khalil Gibran, and it is the quote that starts off the book Fatherhood as Leadership by my friend and author, coach, TEDx speaker, Devon Bandison. And he's on the show today, and I'm so excited for you guys to hear this conversation. You know, it was really important for me to bring him on the show because I want to have guests on the show that are feeding you as women and giving you the knowledge and inspiration and information that you need, and also to give you a different insight. And I think as women, many times, as you'll hear me say on the show, we have this idea of what a man's role or a father's role should be. And we get stuck in that. And for some of us, it's an old paradigm. It's an old way of thinking, and there's some expectations tied into that. And so when I read Devon's book, I was moved to tears. I laughed out loud. It was an amazing book. And I already know several men, fathers in my life who are going to receive this as a gift because that's how powerful it is. Devon and I met very recently, just last year, and we were fast friends. He is an amazing coach. He's one of the most sought after success coaches in the world. He coaches and works with Fortune 100 companies and people from all walks of life, really, athletes, CEOs, salespeople, small business owners. As I mentioned, he's an international TEDx speaker on fatherhood. And really, he's lived his entire life to do this work. You know, I really got that from the book with Devon, is that this is his calling and his mission. And above anything else, he's a dad. And he talks about that in this book and the importance of fatherhood. So again, I'm really excited for you guys to join us today. Have a listen in on our conversation. I know you're going to love it. And when you're done, go on over to SheRisespodcast.com. Leave a message or a comment for Devon in the comment section of the podcast, or join us over on the Facebook group, She Rises Tribe, and tag myself or Devon there to continue the conversation. Enjoy the show, and thanks again for being here. Hey, Devon, welcome to She Rises. I'm so excited to have you on the show.
Hey, Giovanna. Thanks for having me on. It's an honor and a privilege, and excited.
I'm excited to have you here too. And I wanted to give the listeners a little bit of a background because you and I are like new friends. Like we met, when was it? Last year? Is that when we met?
Yeah, last year.
On the phone, right?
Yeah.
And we just like hit it off right away. And then by fluke, we met in person was it Carl Cease, right? We went to that event.
Yep. Kyle Cease, yep.
And I just feel like you're my brother from another mother. Like we've just hit it off.
Yeah, it's amazing. I feel the same way. It's not that we speak every day, but I feel so connected to you. We met at an event last year that I got invited to, and in person. It was one of those things, when you run into somebody and there's an instant connection, and it's been an honor to get to know you, and I love what you're doing with the podcast. I know that, I tease you because at first I reached out to another friend, right? And I said, oh man, Giovanna's doing some great things, but why did she name it Charisse? And I laughed at a little bit. And our mutual friend said, Devon, look at the name again. And I realized it was She Rises. So
I loved that.
Amazing.
I was laughing. I was in tears when I saw that exchange. I was laughing so hard, and I'm like, okay, that's going to just be my stripper name is Charisse.
That's right. It's totally like your ego. I love it.
I love it. And if anyone is listening and your name is actually Charisse, I apologize.
Actually, I know a few Charisses. They're good people. I just didn't understand the connection with the podcast. But I guess She Rises. I mean, I really, all jokes aside, you're doing some amazing work out here.
Thank you. Well, you got it. You got on board. And you're doing amazing work, and that's why I wanted to have you like immediately on the show, especially because your brand new book is out. It's called Fatherhood is Leadership, Your Playbook for Success, Self-Leadership, and a Richer Life. And I was like, I gotta have you on.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy you're here.
Yeah, it's been an amazing. It just came out last week, and it's just been a win for us. Amazing. People are just responding in droves, and I couldn't even understand the impact. I went out and wanted to make a book that really impacted lives and really one relationship, one conversation, one kind act at a time. And I've just been overwhelmed by the amount of love and support all over that the book has had, and just every day from men, women, families, organizations. It's really been humbling experience, and we were #1 release on Amazon last week.
Amazing.
It was all organic. It wasn't any real promotion. It was just, creating, the seeds of years of service and showing up for people in a service, heart-centered leadership mindset, and it just has just come back. And I'm most excited not about how many books go out, but really that it gets in hands and it really helps, one father, one family, one community at a time. I think if we're going to change the world, it really starts with relationships. It starts with one.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. Well, I was sharing with you just before we hit record that, I read it yesterday, and I was in tears 1 minute. I was so touched by what you share and the stories you share and these experiences that you've had. And then the next minute I was laughing out loud. And I just thought it was really well put together. And as a woman, I shared this with you. As a woman, I really appreciate reading it because I think, and this is why I wanted to have you on the show, I think women sometimes we get so wrapped into our experience, right, and our own stuff that we don't really see our partners or the male counterparts in our lives, or maybe even what fathers actually go through. And, for myself, just speaking personally, I really resonated with this piece in the book where when I started to see my father as a person and a flawed person is when I started to release a lot of resentment and hurt. And I think this book just goes a long way into giving people the tools. I mean, some of the exercises that you were giving, I was doing them myself. You asked some really profound questions here. So if you could, let's just dive in a little bit. Give us a bit of your background, because I think your background is extraordinary in how this book came to be.
Yeah, so, it started out, my background has been it started when I was a teenager. There was some drug addiction in my house, and my father, who was my hero growing up, and when my grandmother passed, he turned to drug addiction. And, at that age, I kind of blamed myself and said, what did I do wrong? And oftentimes, whether you're male, female, those first relationships with your parents really is a turning point sometimes on decisions you make and stories you create about the next several years of your life. And at that point, I made a decision, and I called the promise that many young fathers and even mothers make if their parents aren't as involved as maybe you think they should be. And the promise was, when I become a father, I'm going to be a better father than my father. And, a few years later, and when I was finishing college, we had our first daughter, and I was more present, but I had no idea what I was doing. I had no template. I had no, model of what I was doing, and I was making a lot of mistakes. But I was fed at an early age this kind of unhealthy belief system that men don't show they're vulnerable and men don't ask for help. And so at that point, I was just really struggling and suffering in silence. And throughout the years, I dedicated my early career into developing programs for a nonprofit agency. I developed programs for at-risk youth, what they call at-risk youth, I like to call them at Hope Youth. And then also first-time fathers. And from that work, it really had grown and expanded. And I was really making a big impact throughout some of the toughest boroughs and parts of New York City. And I really loved the work. And then a few years back, several years back, the vice president came to me, and I was big into leadership coaching, leadership development on the side, but I had this full-time job. And I was running a program that was serving over 2,000 children and families every year, and had social workers and things like that, and psychiatrists, and really in the community. And then the vice president said, Devon, everywhere you've been, you've built these programs, you have high, employee satisfaction and productivity. So we want to give you this job. And they gave me this promotion. It was better pay, better title, Midtown Manhattan. And about 8 minutes into that job, I realized I made the biggest mistake of my life. It was a toxic environment, it was really negative. And at that time, Giovanna, it was like it was one of the lowest points in my life, because I was also going through a difficult divorce. Mm-hmm. And when I was going through this divorce, I was saying these things. I was in this, what I call the scarcity. You heard the scarcity mindset, where I said, she's going to take everything. I'm going to lose it all. I'm going to be broke. I'm going to eat ramen noodles the rest of my life, and I'm going to be living somewhere on the street on the Bowery. And it really was a low time. And at the same time, I had gone to this leadership training for the nonprofit, and I ran into a guy who became my mentor. He used to work for a guy named David Allen, getting things done. And he met me in the hallway, and he said, Devon, something about you. And, Giovanna, I'm from New York. So when someone said, I'm kind of like, all right, that's what they all say, Jason. And he said, no, really, let's stay in touch. And I really was skeptical. And I said, yeah, that's what they really all say. But he actually stayed in touch, and he sent me some stuff. And this is, to wrap up, about 4 weeks later, he invited me to this retreat. And he sent me an email and said, we have this retreat in OJAI, California. He said, I'll waive the fee. All you have to do is get a place to stay and a plane ticket. And because I still was caught up in this scarcity mindset, I was saying, I don't know if I could do it, a plane ticket. And 3 days went by, and I couldn't really sleep. I had this knot in my stomach, and I realized, if I don't make this commitment, if I don't take this chance, to go out there, I may be living my default future. I may, regret this the rest of my life. So I read the email, I pick up the phone, I call this place called the Lavender Inn. I say, hey, this is Devon. This is my first time in OJ, California. And the lady starts laughing at me, and she says, Devon, you sound like a nice guy, but OJ's that guy we don't talk about too much. She said, this is Ojai. And I said, oh, my bad. So I go down to Ojai, and I sit down. And it was the best decision, one of the best I ever made. And in that 3-day retreat, he asked me 2 questions. He said, what do you have 10,000 hours in? And he said, what would you do if money wasn't an issue? And I said, well, I love fatherhood because, I live and breathe fatherhood. I have 3 children. I've developed programs for fathers in New York. And I love coaching. I love transformational leadership coaching. And he said, build a business around that. And I said, what? He said, no, really, build a business around that. And I circled the date, 3 months on the calendar. I said, I'm going to have my first keynote. I had spoken in conferences for the nonprofit. I circled the date. I invited some people I met who were TEDx speakers, who I met at TEDx just from relationships. They came out, free of charge, and I became the keynote. They recorded me. And within 9 months, or within 9 months of me being in Ojai, I had gotten a call to do my own TEDx talk. And then within a year and a half of that, kind of built my coaching practice to a point where I was at this point where I went to my coach and I said, well, I have to leave my job right away. And because I watch too many Shark Tanks and I have to be a real entrepreneur, right? And
burn the bridges or burn the boats, right?
Boats, right? Burn it off, make the jump, big leap and all this. And he said, slow down. He said, look, you're in a perfect position. Why don't you create a bridge and make your coaching practice so successful that you have to leave? And that's exactly what I did. And within 6 months of that, my coaching practice became full. I went back to my job. And not only did I, was able to leave, but they hired me back to do some coaching at the job I was leaving to help because I saw a need there. And now, life is amazing, beyond my wildest dreams, Giovanna. And I have more time with my children. I travel. and I get to speak to cool people like you.
I love it. I love that story. And for me, like what I got from, listening to you now and, reading it in the book, which you go into much more detail, is I think about myself, I think about other people, and I think about these like multi-passionate entrepreneurs and people that have maybe struggled to find their thing, right? To find their niche or their niche, as the Americans would say, right? And I see, looking at your story and reading it and hearing it, is like, you were made for this. Like, I literally feel like you were just made for this. Like, of course you're a fatherhood and leadership coach. Like, does it feel like that for you? Does it feel like everything has set you up to be here?
It really does. And when I love to, even with my clients, everything that set me up, and that includes the things that at the moment I thought were the worst things in my life. And as I speak to you and I talk about that difficult divorce, I'm a day after. Yesterday, me, my ex-wife, and my son went to the beach, and we had the most amazing day together because we have this just amazing relationship that we've worked on. And it went from a place of just over few years of coming from a place of a difficult divorce. And yes, I believe that everything that I've gone through in my life, just like people out there, everything you've gone through, right, has prepared you for this next step in the journey. And for me, connecting with fathers and understanding that, like, these unhealthy kind of beliefs that we were taught early on, that we don't show people we're vulnerable, that we can't be honest. I didn't want to have a book and create a book that was like, hey, look at the fatherhood guru expert who floats in the sky and is above it all. I wanted a real authentic book of like kind of when I fell short. And, I talk about a lot in the book. And I remember coming back to my nonprofit, for instance, and I came back and I was going to speak to these guys who I ran these programs from the South Bronx. And they were, when I walked in the room, I had this speech I was going to give them. It was a pretty big audience and 45-minute speech. And when I walked in, they said, oh, I saw your TED Talk. And, I basically want my autograph. And they put me on this pedestal. And I realized that this is the exact thing that really would prevent them from hearing a real good message. And I was going to give one speech that day, and I scratched it, and I sat at the end of the table, and I looked out in the crowd, and I scratched the speech, and I said to these guys, I said, hey, listen, my daughter hasn't spoken to me in a couple weeks. She's off at college and I'm feeling a certain way. I need your help. And in that moment, they opened up and they were like, yo, I can understand this. And they gave their insights. And we had so much of an amazing conversation that I realized that men need a space. And in the book, I want to create a space where men can honestly step up into their most authentic self and be vulnerable. Because this book isn't a how-to book. It's not a parenting book. It's how you could become the best version of yourself, where it trickles down to everybody around you. And I liken it to the coffee and the saucer, right? And, I'm from New York, so I don't know what they call it in London. They might call it like a saucer, but in New York, we call it a saucer.
A saucer and a teacup or a coffee cup.
Teacup. And I think as parents and you're the mothers out there and the women out there who are entrepreneurs listening, the same thing with fathers. Like when we serve our family, our communities, our jobs, our friends, and we serve oftentimes out of this cup, and eventually the cup gets empty and we're overwhelmed and we just feel like we get in victim mode. And my job through the book is to show men how to fill their teacup so there's an overflow, and the overflow goes on to the saucer. So when they're serving their children, when they're serving the community, their families, they're serving from the saucer and not the cup.
I love that analogy. And you shared this in the book too, the analogy of the, put the oxygen mask on you first. And I say this to women a lot because to me, when I heard this, it was like, I don't know, some kind of revelation, like the heavens opened up. Because when I had my alternative medicine practice, after almost 8 years, I had what everybody knows now is called a burnout. Like I just burnt out. I didn't want to talk to nobody. I didn't want to give anyone any more health advice. I didn't want to look at any more blood work. I didn't want to do any of it. I just wanted to run. And I realized later somebody called it compassion fatigue. And then later on, when I started to learn this concept of, oh, actually, I have nothing to give if my cup is empty, just like you said. So it's about that. It's not how to find more ways to keep giving. It's how can you give to yourself? And I love that you talk about that in the book, especially for men, because I think sometimes even too as women, you know, one of the things that really struck me reading this is I remember the way I looked at my own father, and even the way I've looked at some of my partners in the past, which is like, oh yeah, like, you know, they got it together. Like they're strong, like they can do it. And you talk in your book about these three main themes that you see men struggle with the most. And you talk about performance, security, and mortality. And I wonder if you can go a little deeper into that so that the women or even the men listening can understand better.
Yeah, and I think I love that you touched on that, and the women listening as well as men. I mean, the women listening, I mean, oftentimes men, we show up and we've been trained to kind of put up a front, and deep down we really struggle with these three things. And the performances inside as a man, we always want to be our best. And we want to show up and see, will we be the best father we can be? And like I said before, even though I didn't have a template, I thought that I had to walk around and act like I had it all together. But oftentimes that same thing was the same thing that prevented me from getting the help I needed and some insight. And the insight often came from your partner or your mother or woman. You know, I was raised by an amazing woman in my mother, who's my hero. And, you know, there's a point where you can also ask for help, but men, that vulnerability is tough to come across. And then there's security. Like, men are really difficult. Like, we have a hard time. Like, we want to know that we are going to be able to protect our family and they're going to be secure, both physically protect them, just goes back a long time, financially and emotionally. And I think that, like, when I work with men, it really is to try to take the mask off, Giovanna, and say, like, what do you want to create? Like, not what your father, what your father was as a father or your mother. You can learn from them, but you have an opportunity to create whatever relationship you want in your life. And the funny thing is, one of my clients, she read the book as well, and she called me about that same chapter about forgiveness with her father. And she realized, for me, forgiveness was not about my father. It was about me freeing myself from kind of this barrier that was preventing me from what was in front of me. And she was so touched. She said she read it 3 times, and she had some questions around the story, because we live our life based in this fantasy. We put labels on people, like our partner, like our father, like our mother. And in all honesty, they're 1 out of 7 billion people in the world. And if I didn't put the label of father or partner on him, would I have the expectations that I have? And that's where we fall short in relationships, and having these expectations that lead to people letting you down and resentments. And, you know, I try to trade those expectations into, like, gratitude and appreciation. How can I appreciate the person in front of me and not have an expectation as in because they're my father? And when I realized, Giovanna, that my father did the best he could with the information and tools he had, it freed me up for everything.
I love that. And I love that you went there, because that was going to be my next question, is around this topic of forgiveness, because I had a similar experience. And you talk about this in the book too. Like, it's not like you just get there, you arrive at some destination and suddenly it's like, okay, it never comes up again. Like, I still have moments where my dad triggers me or he pisses me off somehow, because we're meaning making machines. Like, we have these expectations and someone does something or says something, and we create this whole meaning and this entire story around it. And, like, most of the time it's not even true. So I love that. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, Giovanna.
No, I was going to say, I love that you talked about that in your book, because, again, when I started to see my father as not just my father who should have all his shit together and should have done this and should have done that and shoulda, and I actually started seeing him as a person and seeing where he was wounded and where, you know, he had dreams that he had to give up on, and all these things, you start to develop a sense of compassion. And there's a beautiful lesson, and it's probably the crux of the entire Course in Miracles, but the deepest and truest sense of forgiveness is actually the realization that there was never a transgression.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And the true forgiveness, it's less about someone else and really just unlocking the chains that the mental prison that you put yourself in by living off that story you talk about that we create in our mind. And it really does free you up in all the relationships of your life. I remember, you know, and you're right, it's not like I have arrived, aha moment. It's just a continuous awareness of when this thought comes up, that you just identify. And, I look at the thought now and say, oh, that's just a thought. It's not real, and it'll pass. There's nothing I need to do. There's nothing I need to go and create. It's just understanding that it's a thought. So I was at the Met game once, and this isn't in the book, but I was at the Met game couple of years ago. I brought my father to the Met game. We had front row seats, right? And we're sitting at the Met game, and he turns and this is when you kind of want to say, hey, thank you, man. I never had front row seats. Like, they're bringing your food down. There's cushioned seats. And he turns to me and he says, thanks for it's good to have you back. Now, in my head, right, Giovanni, I'm like, wait a second. Good to have you back means we've been here before, one. Second, like, are you ungrateful? This is what I'm going through in my head, right? And one of my best quotes that I love is Mozart, where it says, music isn't in the notes. Music is in the silence, in the space between the notes. Mm. And between that thought in my head of all this thing that I was triggered in, and before any words came out my mouth, there was this space. There was this silence between the notes. And in that space, that's where something emerged, right? There was a connection, my spiritual connection. Something emerged, and what emerged was that's his way of saying thank you. Mm. And because I was able to acknowledge that, we had an amazing game. He's an amazing grandfather. He's really been, our relationship has been tenfold. Amazing ever since. And it's because listening to that inner kind of voice and allowing that space, and that's what forgiveness does. It frees me from the bondage of my past.
Oh, that's so beautiful. I love that story because it's a practice creating that space, right? Because the ego or that inner child, that voice that comes up that's like, hey, I want to be recognized. Like, you should be appreciating me. Like, that's not even our truest essence, right? That's that little wounded kid. And normally what we do, if we haven't practiced and trained ourselves, is we just react. And then, like, that could have been a whole other experience for you and him. It could have ruined the whole night.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the book, I have activities for men to do. And now it's funny because, the first adopters are always like, when I throw workshops, right, I have specific kind of fatherhood men workshop, but I also have personal professional development workshops. And usually it's about 70-30 women, because women, I just think in the personal development, self-help field, there's like this 60-40, 70-30, being the first adopter. So my first 3 calls who read the book were actually females. And they talked about kind of this breakthrough of identifying kind of where the wounded child, but where now we could create and not fall victim to our stories, and realizing that forgiveness, once my father validated me, I realized that there was no need for validation, because there was, like you said, there was no wrong ever done. And it was only for me to learn through my practice that everything was right just out as it was.
I remember that part in the book, and I loved it because you had already got to such a place of peace and forgiveness around things that you were self-validated. And it was at the moment that you didn't need his validation that it actually came when he sent you that text message.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I love that. I wonder now if you can go into, I love what you bring to fatherhood. I love the vulnerability that you bring. I mean, a lot of parents, mine included, God bless them, right? They had that whole authoritarian, never make a mistake, never look like you made a mistake, act like you know everything. And you have a whole other refreshing, beautiful approach. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, the 3 things that really I focus on in the book is with men is influence, intimacy, and impact. And to me, the reason why fatherhood is leadership is because leadership, like fatherhood, is not about your title. It's about just how your influence. It's about how one life can influence another's life. So anybody can call themselves a dad or a father, but it's really about your influence that makes you a father, just like in leadership. And then the second part is intimacy. And I think that for me, what I've realized is that my children are actually my gurus. They are my greatest teachers. And they always are the mirror that holds me up to the standard, right, that I want to be as a father. So, for instance, I remember, and I tell, the do as I say, not as I do kind of authoritarian parenting, as well as leadership, to me is plain played out. It's not, because children watch what you do. Just like a leader of an organization, when I go into organizations, people watch what the CEO, what the boss does. And it's more about do as I do and do as I say, and not just one without the other. So for instance, and you're going to fall short of that ideal. I fall short many times, but I try to, what I call, have my audio match my video. So it's easy to speak a good game and say a good game, but are you walking what you're talking, right? And my children always point that out. So for instance, a couple of years ago, I roughhouse with my two younger ones, my boys, and research actually shows that men, that's what they can bring to the table. The roughhousing actually helps in their development and cognitive development and ability to socialize later on. So it's not a bad thing, even though I know my mom and mother's always like, stop throwing them up and it's dangerous. And like, that's kind of what we bring. And I remember that, I always roughhouse with them, and they were roughhousing this specific day. And I had like a proposal that was due, and I really didn't actually fill my cup that day and wasn't really at my best. And I was tight, and they were just loud. And I turn around and I'm like, cut the, and I go off and yell at them. And they both look like shocked and amazed, like, because they know that, like, I'm pretty cool, man, calm and collected. I'm probably a fun parent, maybe not, whatever. Like, I don't take too much too serious. And my son, my 15-year-old at the time, looks at me, and my youngest son's looking at me, and he says, Dad, can I ask you something? And I'm like, what? What do you want to ask me? And he says, I had the podcast at the time. He knew I was coming out of the book. He said, what part of fatherhood is leadership is that? And there was a pause and a silence, right? Because if I would have been like the old school parent, like back talk, backhand, how dare you? And I paused, and we just started dying laughing. I said, you're absolutely right, man. You're absolutely right. Right? And that to me is the beauty of intimacy. Into me, you see, like into me, I see, right? The intimacy of allowing someone to understand that you fall short, and me showing my children that yes, Dad stands for something. He stands in these possibilities, and he's human and falls short is the greatest lesson. And they always bring it up to me, and they actually are my greatest teachers.
I absolutely loved that story when I read it. That was one of my LOL kind of laugh outside moments, because I was like, first of all, I was like, oh God, I wonder what would happen if I would have said that to my father. I probably would have got the backhand or something, right? But right. I just loved, because the reason I loved it is because what you're espousing and what you talk about a lot is that you don't have to have all your shit figured out as a parent, as a dad. Like, you can show them I'm a work in progress and I'm vulnerable. And it's actually, I kind of put myself in your son Justice's shoes when he said that, because I was like, he must have felt just a closer connection with you. He must have felt like, oh, my dad's real. I can just kind of call him on stuff lovingly. It didn't sound like he said it snarky or,
Right. And that's what I learned, Giovanna. Like, my job isn't to create mini versions of me as a parent. And kind of like do as I say, not as I do, gives the impression of like, I know better than you and I can't learn anything. And for me, my job as a parent is to create a space for my children to grow into the best version of what was meant for them. And if that was coming up for my son and he didn't have a space to kind of he was basically questioning, Dad, this is what you say you're about. Is this part of it? If I didn't allow for that space for him to do that, he may have shut down in the future and not feel like he had a voice. And I mean, my son is an amazing leader, and my daughter's doing some great things. And I don't take credit because of that. It's because of the space that for them to step into their own leadership and their own best version of themselves. And I think that's what it's about nowadays. When I see this shift, I'm trying to shift the paradigm of modern day father and how fatherhood's viewed. I think that oftentimes people see me with my kids or someone will go out and in the city, you see fathers with their children more than any time in history. But oftentimes we relate to a bad experience. So I hear some version of, oh, you're doing great with fathers. They need more like you. But in reality, there's more fathers involved in their children's lives than any other time in history. And the problem out here isn't a fatherhood crisis. I think that one of the issues out here is we have a relationship crisis. That somewhere along the way, we forgot we belong to one another, whether we're together or not. I think that is, to me, why I'm focusing on men becoming the best version of themselves so they can show up and be better leaders in their family, whether they're married, divorced, outside their family, in the community, and then ultimately in the world.
Amen. I love that. I want to like put that on a loop and just play it over again. I love that. It is. I really believe that. It's funny, when I started coaching, it was relationship coaching. It was my first love. It's still my love, but it's evolved now because, like you said, everything is about relationship. And I love that. We belong to each other. So we need to nurture these things. And you are so great at that. And I have to tell you, I kind of hinted off air that I was going to share this insight, but now's the perfect time to share it. I really see, with all the story that you share around your dad and the difficult initial experience that you had and that promise, right? Like, I'm never going to be like that. I'm going to be a totally different dad. And there was a moment when you were telling the story of bringing your son to, it wasn't a basketball game. I think it was the draft pick.
Yeah, the NBA draft.
Yeah, and you talked about you were in 205, which is pretty much the nosebleeds, and you had all these cool things happening, and the entire section was engaged, and everybody was and I was reading that going, of course, like, that is Devon. Like, of course, he's got everyone talking and everybody's best buddies. But it reminded me of how you lovingly described your dad at the beginning. And I really saw in you that you took that like best piece of him almost, because I could picture that. I could picture being there and you just doing that.
Yeah. I definitely, that was, my son actually said that was the best day of his life. And I'll never forget that. And when I asked him, he's a big basketball fan, why that was the best day of his life, he didn't say anything about the basketball part of our night. He talked about exactly what you said. Like, we were in the nosebleed sections all the way at the top. And when I first went in, I thought it was, the worst seats. And we just went and connected with everybody, joking and laughing and connecting. And there's still guys from section 205 who live in France who just told me they got the book. And like 2 years later, it's just amazing. And I think that's one of the things. It's a gift I feel like I have, but also something that I love to show my children, that if you treat people, if you really come from a place of service, and there's so many people in the world who has it twisted where they're trying to get something to give something instead of just giving from their heart. And sometimes the best thing you could give someone is a smile, a hug, a conversation, have them understand that you're just actually listening to them. And for me, that has been kind of the secret ingredient, I would say, of my kind of success as a coach, and that I'm not out here trying to get real. I just want to serve in a way. And sometimes that's just a conversation. I say it in the book that you don't have to change the world by the next new invention. You could change the world one conversation at a time, one relationship at a time, and one kind act at a time.
And you live that. I hope you hear that. Like, I really just see how you live that, and people just instantaneously fall in love with you. And I could see that. I could see that in 205 when you guys were all sitting there. I'm like, of course they stuck around late. Of course, because Devon was there and he was probably starting it all up. I love that. And
well, too, Giovanna. I feel like I instantly fell in love with you when we met too. And we had a nice little crew. All of a sudden, we had a bunch of people surrounding us. So I think we make a pretty good team.
Yeah, I think so too. I love it. I think when you emanate that energy, and what I love most, to echo what you said, is that you model that for your children. Like, you don't need to walk around with your heart closed, assuming everyone's your enemy and seeing the world from this, protective, fearful place. Like, it's just being open-hearted and talking to people with respect, joking around with them and opening up.
Yeah, and that's a work in progress too. Like, that's always been my heart, Giovanna. However, I'm from New York. I drive this. I'm on the subways. We're not used to like just say, "Oh, I'm vulnerable today. How you doing?" Like, New Yorkers have that face like, "Listen, don't talk to me." But deep down, and I think that's really prepared me, because deep down, I saw the beauty in even the tough exterior of, some of the most difficult parts of New York. And as I traveled and I was able to go all over, and my love for California out there, I think that the more you work on yourself, all this stuff to me is an inside job. There's nothing outside of me that I can get that's going to allow me to realize that I already have everything I need inside of me. And the more I went inward for my happiness, the more I went inward for my success, the more I went inward for like how to create the financial prosperity I wanted and the love and the relationships, it started reflecting outside. And I think the inside out approach is the only way that I found to be my most authentic self, because authenticity, I think, like vulnerability, if not questioned, is overused sometimes. So when I tell folks, I said authenticity, like when you go into the room with your 6-year-old nephew or your 6-year-old son, do you stop at the door and say, wait a second, I have to be more authentic? No, you just go in, you get on the floor and you roll around and you say whatever comes to your mind. And oftentimes, if you haven't done the work on the inside out approach, the inside work to like open your heart, you don't even allow the world to see that. And for me, I think that the more lives I can touch just in a conversation, and the more people I could be of service to, I know the better my world will be.
I agree. And I want to take us to your firstborn, because there was I said to myself, there's a part in the book where she's secretively and anonymously getting ready to present you with an award at an event, and she had to write a letter about you as a dad. And I said to myself, oh, this is so good. I'm going to read it on the show. And I realize I won't get through it. I will be sobbing. It will be completely unintelligible, and I'm not going to do it. But I am going to read the one line that just, broke my heart open, but also like was one of the biggest reasons I wanted you on the show to talk about fatherhood, especially being a father to a young girl. And she says in this one line, for those of you that don't have the book, when you get it, it's page 132. But she says, unlike others, my dad wasn't the first heartbreak, but he was the one who showed me unconditional love. And I cannot tell you, it broke me open, because for so many women, their dad is their first heartbreak. It's where they first experience the masculine not being the leader or letting them down. And this just made me it just broke me open. And can you talk to us a little bit about maybe how it's been different for you with your daughters, or your daughter versus your sons?
Yeah, well, now you got me tearing up a little.
I know, I'm all choked up. I'm so glad the video's not on.
I'm like, well, yeah. Oh, man. And it's a good thing. And that's what I want to show the men that I work with and the world. Like, it's okay to tear up, because that, to me, there's some connection between father and daughter. My daughter was our firstborn. I was 23 when she was born. And it just changed everything, Giovanna. It changed how I looked at women. Not that I had a negative look, but it was a different perspective now that I have a daughter. It changed how, how I was speaking, how I was treating. Not that it was a bad thing at the time. I just was young and dumb and didn't know. But it changed everything. And my daughter, raising a daughter, has been probably the greatest gift of my life. And she has by far taught me the more about life than I could ever teach anyone in this world. She's such an amazing young woman. And throughout the years, she's just been daddy's little girl. And we've had amazing conversations. She's 19 now. And the conversations she has with me, I'm like, man, I wish I knew what you know at 19. I started figuring I was asking these questions at 35 maybe. And she's just, raising a young woman is just really, words can't describe it. And the day you spoke about, she surprised me. I wanted her to come to my keynote I was doing for the Real Dads Network. And she had written, they give an award for the Real Dad of the Year award. And it's kind of anonymous. And she had reached out and wrote this letter about me. And I was going on to give this keynote. And they said, before we do the keynote, we want to give the Real Dad of the Year award. And they read this amazing thing. And I was tearing up. And I realized about 3/4 through that she had written it. And they gave me this, it was just from her heart. And for me, I didn't have to be her heartbreak. I really wanted to show her from an early age that like men stand and fathers stand by their daughter. And I treated her like a queen and told her like, you know, one of the greatest things she tells me is that she also isn't looking outside for validation from other men, from other girls, you know, because women, you know, girls at early age in high school and college can be difficult to in relationships, I'm learning. And she's really grown into this mature, powerful, loving young lady, and I don't take all the credit. She is an amazing mother as well, and our co-parenting has been really great over the years. But it's just, to me, by far my greatest teacher, and it warms my heart every time I speak about her. And you know, I just she's at that age where she's like, "Dad, I need a little more space," and it's like, let it go, but it's like watching a flower blossom, and it's just amazing.
I mean, I have to tell you, just again, reading this was profound to me, and it's true what you said there. I just want to pick on one piece of that, because if women, you know, and of course it's boys too, young men, but if we don't have great examples as our, you know, initial parents, you know, one of the things I say all the time, I say, you know, I think I've repeated it on this podcast umpteen times, but you know, one of our responsibilities as adults is to learn to reparent ourselves.
Right.
And for some people, I mean, that's really hard work and a lot of work because we didn't get that great example. And that's why I believe what you're doing and what so many moms are doing that are actually doing help for motherhood as well, is that what you're doing with your mission is really laying that foundation for her to write this. And if I recall correctly, she was 16 or 15 when she wrote this.
Yeah.
You know, for her to already write this at this age, of course she doesn't need to look for external validation from boys. You know, I remember doing that as a young girl, and maybe even not that long ago. Right? Because, you know, if you don't have that, we don't realize, but unconsciously as women, we're perpetually looking for that. We're perpetually looking for daddy's love. So I think that's why I was so broken open when I read this. And again, I wish I could read it on the show for you ladies listening, but I will not get through it. I will just start blubbering in tears.
Yeah, you know, it's funny, Gia, like I can't even, every time I hear it or read it, I still will tear up. And it's a beautiful thing. Like, it's such a beautiful connection. And like, for instance, I don't know where I learned this thing. Like, I always walk on the outside of the curb, right? So I remember she came back and she said, "Dad, I had this date." And I told the guy, I said, "Listen, she says to the young man, she says, "I don't expect you to know this, right? But my father always had me walk on the inside my whole life. So I'm going to just let you know off bat, you got one chance." And I thought that was like the coolest thing. She's like, "He opens doors too. So I'm just letting you know my expectations now. And then we could go from there." And I thought it was one of the coolest things. She came back and told me.
I absolutely love her already. That's awesome, because because you're modeling what a gentleman should do and how he should treat his woman and how he should be the leader in a relationship, and the woman is his queen. And I mean, you're working, like, this is grassroots, like ground level stuff, because how much, and of course I tell my friends that get nervous about screwing up their kids, I'm like, you're going to do it anyway. You're not perfect. Like, just surrender that. But at the same time, you're doing so much by way of planting a beautiful foundation. And with that, I did want to talk about a really important piece. And I see this, you know, I'm not blessed to have children of my own. I probably won't in this lifetime, and I'm okay with that. But I've had 7 nieces and nephews who I adore. And I've watched my sisters and other moms and dads go through that, like, letting go, that surrender piece. And I know that you just recently had to go through this with your daughter going away to college. So will you talk about that a little bit and your experience of that?
Yeah, it's one of the things where it's like, I used to watch the old Kung Fu movies, and they always had this theme of, like, when we've heard it before, the Buddha saying of, like, when the teacher is ready, the student appears. And only over the last few years and my daughter being the oldest, I've learned from her is that, like, it was very hard to let go initially. But when I started looking at her as, like, she is her own leader, and she is actually one of my greatest teacher, that while hard to let go, it's one of the most beautiful things to allow happen. And I think that parents oftentimes think that their children's failures, or when they fall short, or when they, in their view, mess up, it's some type of reflection on them. And I really don't believe that. I think that you want to create a space for your children to be able to go out on their own and make mistakes, because I wouldn't be the person I am today if I didn't make mistakes. And I used to say, when people said a life coach, how do you become a life coach? One of my things I used to tell them was, well, basically, I really messed my life up early on in my life bad, and I try to learn from it, and I try to help other people not do the same thing and create miracles. So, I think that you want children to feel like failure isn't really failure. It's an opportunity, and that's where the greatest growth comes. So while letting go of my daughter in college was very hard, Giovanna, again, I was getting like a little teary-eyed and seeing her come into her own. I knew she was ready. And that's because of the work and the conversations we had already done leading up to it. And does that mean she made every decision right in college? No. And I don't make every decision right now in adulthood. So give them a break, allow them to grow, allow them to fall short, and allow yourself to do the same.
I love that. This is the last piece here I want to touch on because I think it's important. This is another piece that had me crying. Is on page 100, you talk about a really terrifying experience you had up in the air flying, and you've got these questions here. And I'm gonna read the questions, and then if you could after share the story with us. The questions that came to you in that moment were: did I show them enough that I love them? Did I make enough time for them? Will they have an amazing life? See, I'm getting choked up. Did I teach them enough? Did I allow them to teach me enough? Did I listen with love? And can you tell us how these questions came to you?
Yeah, I thought the last day on earth for me, I was near death. I had one of the most amazing weekends in San Antonio, and I got on a plane. I take the same airline, and this time they didn't have my airline. So first I get to this airline that I didn't want to take, and I go to the front and I bought a ticket, and they said, you have to wait till somebody cancels. And I was like, what? I bought a ticket. So they put me in the last row of this airline. And we're sitting on the tarmac for like 30 minutes and nobody's saying anything. And like I said, I'm from New York, Giovanna. San Antonio, people are like the nicest people in the world, right? And they're like so friendly and just chill, right? But believe me, if we were sitting on a runway for 35 minutes in New York, there'd be some problems up in there, right? So we're sitting on the runway, and all of a sudden the captain gets on the loudspeaker and like in this frantic yelling voice, we aren't even in the air. He yells and says, we're not going anywhere until I know you're safe and I'm safe. And I'm like, whoa. First of all, I didn't know we weren't safe, right? This was around the time a couple of years ago where Texas had all these floods and we didn't know this was going on. So finally, I'm nervous. We get in the air. About 20 minutes into the air, it was like a head-on collision. And it was the impact. I travel a lot on planes. I go all over, and turbulence doesn't bother me. I've never experienced anything like this. And the back of the plane, I'm looking out the back, is fishtailing. And this aircraft, it was like a head-on with a semi-truck. And it's like fishtailing, and the impact was so powerful that the cabinets opened up and people's luggage were coming down. I feel like it was so scary that the adults the children, the babies got quiet and the adults were screaming, right? And I'm on this airline, and I'm like, oh, this is it. Like, we're going down. And I turn behind me to get some comfort, and there's this young woman who you could tell it's probably her first year. She's pretty brunette, and she's just like sitting in her seat, holding her seat like it was going to be like ejected from the plane. And she's the stewardess. And I turn to her and I'm like, is this normal? Are we okay? And she looks at me, Giovanna, and you could tell all her training from flight school was kicking in of keep calm and don't tell the passengers there's a problem. And you could tell she wanted to tell me, and she opens her mouth and says, no, we're not. Oh, God. And I said, what? And in that moment, I realized, I just got quiet and I was nervous, and I realized I was going to die. And all of a sudden, again, there was that space between the notes, and there was this silence. And in that silence, there was nothing that I was worried about how much money I accumulated, the house, the car, the whatever. The only thing that really came up was these experiences with my children and relationships and loved ones. And with my children, it was these questions that came up, the ones that you read. Did I give enough? Did I love enough? Did I listen with love? And in that moment, the beauty of it, Giovanna, that it got really quiet, got really silent. And I was, because of the work I had done and because I had done transformational work with myself, I felt good about what I was leaving as my legacy with my children. I felt like I did give them all of me while I was here. And there was a peace in that. And thank goodness the universe had different plans and we landed, and I'm here to talk about it. But it was really a turning point and a really powerful moment in my life.
And you use this in the book to really highlight to men, which and nowadays I think applies to women too, is, you know, what's in your bank account, what accolades you achieved, you know, what awards you won, or, you know, the business you started, like all of that outside stuff in that moment, right? In that last moment, that's not what you were thinking about.
It didn't matter. It didn't matter. And it was really confirmation of, for me, the service or contribution to my children is my contribution to the world, and my contribution to my clients is my contribution. So it's less about what I'm getting and accumulating, whether it's the accolades or the money or that. All that is fine. I think money is only a reflection of the service you're given anyway. But it didn't matter in the moment. What mattered was, did I give enough? Did I give enough love? Was I there enough and present? And those are the things that matter. You know, I work with a guy who's a big head honcho in a financial Fortune 100 company. And he works with money all day. And he says, you know, Devon, people spend their whole life trading time for money, only to wish at the end of their life they could give the money back for more time. And I don't want to get to the end of my life and want to give more stuff back for more time. I want to make my time matter. And that's why being present in the moment, being loving, being giving in the moment to your children, to your families, to your community, to me is what it's about.
I have one last question. I lied. I said the other one was the last one, but this is really the last one.
All right.
What has been the lesson that it has taken you the longest to learn?
That is that's a great question. That's like an Oprah Super Soul Sunday question, I feel. I like that.
You know why? Yeah. You know why you feel that way?
Why?
Because it is an Oprah Super Soul
It's funny. You know that I'm like you know me. I'm a Super Soul Sunday guy. Like
I caught that last week on Facebook when we were both sharing posts from Super Soul. I'm like, he's watching Super Soul Sunday too. And in one of my last podcasts, I said I'm gonna start playing with these Super Soul questions, and I purposely saved that one for you today. I'm like, I want to see if he catches it. You totally got it.
I love that. No, it's like, the lesson really that took me the most to learn, or the longest to learn, has been that everything in this moment and being present is exactly how it's supposed to be. That I can create change, I can create transformation, I could create great business relationships, but I have to first be okay and loving of what is in the here and now. And the more that I'm presence has been the thing that's taken me the longest to learn. The more I am connected to my reality of the here and now, the more that I see life for the beautiful thing that it is and everything around it.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Devon, you know I love you. I love the work you're doing in the world. I love this book. For those of you listening that have not gotten the book, it's called Fatherhood is Leadership, Your Playbook for Success, Self-Leadership, and a Richer Life. I know some people in my life who are going to get this as a gift. Ladies, if you're listening, get it for the men in your life. Get it for the fathers in your life. Get it for yourself. Like I said, I got so much just for myself in this book. Thank you for writing it and for everything you do, Devon, and mostly thank you for being on the show.
Well, it's been an honor and a pleasure, and to all those listeners out here, I really appreciate what you're doing out here in the world. And Giovanna, keep up the great work. You're really impacting lives, and I love you a lot.
Love you too, brother. Thank you so much for tuning in, and keep rising, everyone.
For books and resources related to today's episode, make sure you head over to sherisespodcast.com, and I'll see you there. If you've enjoyed today's episode, make sure you tune back in next week when I dive into more juicy topics to help make your life the best it can be. And hey, if you've enjoyed listening to the show and you love it, head on over to iTunes and leave me a rate and review and subscribe there to the show.